Okay, welcome to the introduction on our carbon negative power plants. Today we're going to talk about what makes our plants carbon negative by design, and that's the carbon credit aspect. We're going to talk about quite a lot about carbon credits, what makes a carbon credit, the different types of carbon credits, our focus on carbon credits, but the key reason about why they're valuable and why we explore them. So, carbon credits. We'll start with what is a carbon credit. Now, a carbon credit is very simply, it's a unit of measurement assigned to a volume of carbon. Now, there's really two primary types of carbon credits, or two ways we can look at them. One is how much carbon, actually might just take it back a step. So if we think about carbon, carbon's in everything, as we know. Carbon is in the atmosphere, carbon is integral to the world, to our atmosphere, it needs to be there. Now, we won't get into kind of politics or climate change too much in this, but there is certain mandates and certain reasons why carbon needs to be removed from the atmosphere, or the amount of carbon in the atmosphere needs to be limited. Again, we won't talk about the reasons for the politics in this, but we're going to talk about the fact that there is a business opportunity in the fact that there is a demand for this. So there's two primary forms of carbon credits, and these are very simple. They are avoidance and they are removals. So like the name suggests, avoidance is avoiding carbon going to the atmosphere. Removals is removing carbon from the atmosphere. I'll give you an example. We're going to focus more heavily on removals, but I'll give you some examples of avoidance. Very simply, solar power. Solar power doesn't create carbon. I'm talking about the energy generation of the solar, not the manufacturing of the solar or the disposal of the solar here. But solar panels themselves will generate electricity. Now, usually that electricity is replacing electricity that may have been generated from coal or by oil or by gas. So because of that, it's avoiding CO2 being burnt and released into the atmosphere. So that's a certain type of avoidance. Also, a few others, wind energy, and a few even forestation or afforestation, they're often called, which is avoiding cutting a forest down to keep the carbon, avoid the carbon being removed from the atmosphere. Now, personally, as we know, solar has become very cheap to generate, as has wind. So most of these, and I'm not a big fan of that one, to be honest, but as we know, these are now quite viable without carbon credits associated with them, because generally it's going to be cheaper to generate solar and or wind at certain times of the day, not 24 hours, without the need for government intervention in the forms of carbon credits. So these avoidance are decreasing for sure. Where we're seeing the increase in the market and the higher value is in removals. So we're going to talk about removals. Before we get into removals, we're going to talk about two other aspects which cross over into both. And this is the two markets of carbon credits. And these two markets are compulsory and voluntary. Again, very similar as the name suggests. Compulsory is mandatory, voluntary is effectively optional. So difference is certain countries, such as Australia, has we've got different types of compulsory carbon credits. Some of different names. One is the safeguard mechanism. We have the ACCU, which is the ACCU, Australian Carbon Credit Unit. Now, again, we're not going to go into these too much, and every country has slightly different, but these are effectively government mandated that certain companies or certain industries or certain sites need to reduce their emissions by because the government has required it. Voluntary is a little bit different in the fact that there's no mandate, no compulsion from an authority, but there is a private company or a public company who is deciding they're going to reduce their own emissions, maybe to make their shareholders happy, maybe to create their public image a bit higher. They want to reduce their emissions. So they are voluntarily buying carbon credits. Now, they could also be reducing their emissions by using less carbon. A lot of them are doing that, but a lot of them it's very difficult for. Now, just some examples of this is maybe there's a large data center that uses a lot of coal-powered electricity. They can't control where all their electricity comes from, so for them to lower their emissions, they need to buy carbon credits. There's a few other, the examples are endless. There's obviously very large companies. Microsoft, who we all know, is one of the largest doing it, but pretty much most of the large tier 1 tech companies are involved in voluntary carbon markets. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, we've talked about the removal, we'll talk about, avoidance, removal. So we're going to come back to removals here. Okay, now removals in particular, as we said, are removing carbon from the atmosphere. Another term for this is actually engineered certificates, because they're usually more man-made in intervention. Obviously, the world, whether it's the oceans, whether it's the trees, will naturally sequester carbon, but this is now engineering a solution to do it faster. So some of these options, and there's a whole range of them, things like DAC, which is just direct air, that's an R, direct air capture. So literally as it sounds, carbon is directly being captured and sequestered out of the air. That's a very, very expensive process to do, and its only real output is sequestering that carbon. So there is definitely projects that are proceeding with DAC. Our main focus, and what we're going to talk a little bit more about on, is biochar. So biochar is, quite simply, it is converting the organic matter, an organic substance, in a timber, in a biomass that's usually at the end of its life, into solid carbon instead of that carbon being released back into it. So it's using nature for the first half, which is to sequester the carbon. DAC is using engineering to sequester that carbon, to suck it out the atmosphere. Biochar uses nature because the carbon is already sequestered into that tree. And all it's then doing is it's using a man-made engineered process to lock that biochar into a solid form. Now we've got another video on biochar that will explain that a bit better, so you can go watch that. But we're going to focus here on the carbon credits associated with biochar. Now, actually, we'll take a little look at how carbon credits are verified and manufactured. Because there's a little term called greenwashing that some of us may have heard of, which is effectively it's carbon credit money going to projects that are maybe not as beneficial for the environment. So there's now quite a lot of independent organisations. Some of them are on the voluntary side, some are on the compulsory side, that will do independent verification of certain biochar projects and the carbon credits associated with them. Now, just to give you some example, there's Verra, Gold Standard, Puro. So these are the verification bodies, and what they're saying is the carbon, and these are not just for biochar, these are for many different aspects. The carbon, the credit has been verified, and you've been issued a cork, which is a carbon credit unit, or a similar unit, which is a carbon credit certificate. Okay, there's many, many steps involved in this verification process. There's things like, what is the feedstock? Obviously, we aren't going to be cutting down prime Amazon rainforest for these kind of credits, so if that's the case, biochar credits are not valid. So the feedstock is at the end of its life, it's not going to be a valuable feedstock, it could be a waste feedstock, but if it isn't turned into biochar, it's going to add that carbon back into the atmosphere. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is traceability. Once that biochar is made, we need to ensure very highly that it's traced and it is being used for the correct purpose, which is putting the biochar back in the ground to sequester the carbon. And these is mainly under agricultural, AGROs. Mainly agricultural usage. Okay, now we're going to talk about the financial markets involved with this. So, compulsory and voluntary definitely have different size markets. Again, what we're going to focus on here is the removal size market, just the carbon removal market. And we look now, today is 2026. The latest data we had was 2025, so we might just use that. But the data from 2025, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of different metrics and financials around forecasts for anything. So we're going to give a bit of a broad range. We like to focus on closer forecasts. So we're going to focus here on 2034 because it's only 10 years away. When you look at 2050 forecasts, they often just get too blurred. So in the next 10 years, there's more data, the forecasts are a bit more accurate. What we see here, so this carbon removals market, this is what we're talking about here. The size of this market right now is at about $4 billion. $4 billion US dollars. So, which is obviously a large market, but it's not a huge, significant market. We're very, very much in the infancy of carbon removals. I mean, as a whole, carbon credits as a whole, but in particular removals. Now, what the most interesting aspect about this whole thing is, over the next 10 years, again, many different studies on this, but we're looking anywhere from 47 billion up to 250 billion. So if you think about this market growth over 10 years, it's absolutely exceptional. We're sitting at an average, on the lower end, at about a 56% compound annual growth rate. Anyone who knows, if you're sitting at a 6 or 7% compound annual growth rate, that is considered very, very high. So carbon credits is one of the fastest growing industries. Carbon removal credits is one of the fastest growing total addressable markets in the world. So it's incredibly fast. Now, how does a carbon credit actually not just get created, but how does the value get created for the carbon credit? So as we mentioned, the big boys over here, they need to reduce their emissions for shareholder pressure. So Microsoft will say, okay, I've got a budget of $100 million this year. It's allocated in our P&L to go towards reducing our carbon emissions. We want to reduce our carbon emissions by, let's say, 1 million tons, sorry, no, that's not dollars, 1 million tons of CO2. So they then go to the market, the voluntary carbon market, and they look for different ways to do it. Now, one of the other aspects which I actually didn't talk about earlier is there's two other main things we see here. One, along with removal under avoidance, This is natural carbon credits. So these are the carbon credits associated with more natural products, and that's things like planting trees, sometimes wind or solar, but not often. Usually it's associated with planting trees. So the price point we see for natural carbon credits is really at about, probably averaging about $7 to really $24 per ton of carbon credit. So that's what someone like a Google or a Stripe is really willing to pay for that. All that means is trees have been planted that probably weren't going to be planted that are now going to sequester the carbon. But the market that, again, we're focused on, and I'll talk about biochar here really exclusively, is that removal and then that biochar. The market price for these biochar credits by the same types of buyers are really in the realm of probably about $100 to kind of up to $300 per ton. Now, obviously, it's quite high, it's quite premium. The reason it's considered a premium carbon removal credit is around the permanence. Because biochar, solid biochar, which I can show you right here. Bear with me, I should have opened this earlier. Solid biochar, which is solid carbon, locks in that biochar. The current data is really around 100 plus years, but there's a lot of new data that's soon going to get published that's going to be 1,000 plus years. Meaning this carbon is now locked away for 1,000 years and it's not going to get released into the atmosphere. So Microsoft, for example, and I don't mean to pick on Microsoft, there's dozens of them, hundreds of them, but Microsoft are one of the biggest, purchasing, and they're happy to pay a premium because they know it's a really, really high quality removal. Also, as well, right now, especially with biochar and also DAX, is there's an undersupply in the market, meaning there's a lot more buyers than there is producers of verified carbon removal credits. So because of that supply demand, the price gets driven up. So as we see, there's clearly a big market, and growing market is the most important thing, not just for carbon credits, but for carbon removal credits, in particular biochar, which is our focus. Now, there's a lot of rules around how the biochar needs to be treated, and we talk a lot about this in our biochar video, so feel free to jump over to that video and have a look. But I hope that gives you a better understanding of the carbon credit market in the world, especially the carbon removal market, and especially the biochar carbon market, and why it's highly in demand. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next time.